Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our next lightning talk speaker, Leslie Wilson, who's a professor here at UCSF, who's been working in the area of patient preference, a very high priority for FDA. So Leslie is going to talk about weighing patient preference for upper limb devices. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming back so quickly. It went off. Okay, I'm going to give another one of those rapid lightning talks. I'm going to talk about why the FDA is interested in patient preference, and also give an example of the study that I'm doing through the Cersei Center on innovative limb prosthetics and patient preference. So patient preferences, patient groups essentially have been demanding a voice in medical decisions for a long time. And also now the FDA is integrating that patient voice into their drug and device regulatory process in a big way. And they've taken a lot of steps to progress this. They've published patient preference guidances. They've had a lot of educational sessions and a lot of case studies in many of these disease areas looking at patient preference to inform the regulatory decisions. And they're also focusing a lot on the scientific rigor, and we're working on the quantitative methods of patient preference measurement using discrete choice. And all of this is being done through the UCSF-Stanford Cerseis and other Cerseis, and they're playing a major role really in the education and science of discrete choice. So just our studies that we're doing through the Cersei Center in collaboration with the FDA are the one I'm going to present about prosthetics and also renal replacement therapies with some of the faculty here who are developing, and islet cell transplant in type 1 diabetes. So we have all of these studies going. So here is, I'm going to talk about our study, which is looking at prosthetics. The rapid innovation in prosthetics, I think people are aware of how astonishing these devices are in development, and they have amazing kinds of motion and movement. Here's one of our patient collaborators on our study trying out one of these devices. And our study is in upper limb. There are 2.2 million people now with limb loss. But despite many of these people adopting a prosthetic, up to 70% of them are not using their prosthetic. So somehow this prosthetic adoption is highly preference sensitive. And the FDA realizes and developers realize that we need to know how they're weighing the risks and benefits of the decision to use these prosthetics for regulatory decisions in this area. So our objective for our study was to determine how patients weigh the risks and benefits of two prosthetic innovations. And we'll do this with the idea of using it in regulatory decisions. One, osseointegration, is when you insert a titanium rod into your bone, and you can snap the prosthetic onto this, and you get a lot more feeling of motion from this, but there's a constant risk of infection, the downside to this. The other is myoelectric control, which is inserting electrodes into the muscles and innervating so you have a sense of sensation, and these are combined. So what is patient preference? This is an example, a simplified version of our discrete choice measure. And you can see, just looking on the left, first job is to figure out what attributes are important to patients in weighing risks and benefits of this decision. So we have chosen these, and then you have different levels of each of these attributes, and you list them first in two columns, and you say if you had only these two choices, device A or device B, which would you choose? And so you can see there's a difference in experience of pain, a difference in your independence in cooking dinner, 8 versus 2 grip patterns, and then different levels of infection risk, 1 in 100 versus none. So then you're asked to choose which would you choose collectively when you're reviewing these items. And then you would get a second scenario with same attributes, different levels, and you're asked again to choose which one. And you can see I've kept them all the same for this example. If the chance of infection increased to 50 in 100, you might make a different choice across these scenarios. So that's generally how these are asked. This is an example of our real patient preference measure, and you can see that it's a little more complicated looking. It has video, so we can show motion and things like that. And this I'll talk about as a sample of our 25 patients with upper limb loss for this study, looking at these innervations. And we then asked paired choices 18 times. And the analysis is a mixed effects regression, which you come up with beta coefficients, which then are reflective of the preferences, part with utilities or preferences of the patients for the different levels of each of the attributes. So here are the characteristics of our people, and you can see that it's a small sample size, but we do have a lot of variability across things. Most people have had their upper limb loss due to trauma. They're mostly less than 60. Many are married, and you can see the other things. And the use of their prosthetics, many of them are just using them less than 1 hour a day, for example. So here are our results, and it's a lot on this slide, but you can just look at the red numbers under the beta coefficients, and you can see that the size of this number reflects the preference of the for this different item. And so the strongest negative preference for these patients is pain, with negative 1.47. And the strongest positive preference is for being independent completely with cooking dinner. And you can see they also want to avoid strongly hospitalizations from surgeries, which you might have to put the titanium rod in. And they also care about grip patterns, though they might not care as strongly. You can see about 8 grip patterns at the bottom. They'd rather have 4, so they might not want as much complexity as you think. This also shows that they don't care that much about the infection risk as long as it's treatable. And they also don't care as much about the feelings of sensation. So this can tell developers something. So what do we do with this information? I gave this example when I submitted in a pre-submission proposal to the FDA. And this is actually about the lower limb study that we're also doing. But it's an example of the data on the left that the Oprah PRO study, people who were developing a prosthetics gave to the FDA in support of their prosthetic. And you can see they would have measured in clinical trials and their wonderful benefits of improved range of motion, increased prosthetic use, improved quality of life. And then they also, of course, list the risks. 61% continue to have an infection risk, but very treatable. Pain, 12%, and injury, 8%. And then the conclusion was really that the benefits, which are very strong, are outweighing the risks, and so we should approve. But in our preference study, which was similar to our lower limb, our upper limb, but different, you can see that the patients, the risks numbers are in red, the beta coefficients, and the benefits are in blue. You can see that the patients have much stronger beta coefficients under the risks than they do the benefits. So here can give you an indication that the patients care a lot more about the risks than they do about the benefits. So they may not be willing to take these risks for the benefits. So our final slide, the FDA impact, there's a lot of value in patient preference that's already been generated by the FDA. We've shown that these studies can help in the risk-benefit decisions. They can inform FDA guidances. There's been a lot of education. Patient advocacy groups for rare diseases have been very helpful in adopting this. And it's been helpful patient preference in drug device development and in clinical trial decisions of how to measure outcomes. Challenges still exist. There's sort of a lack of consensus on the definition and scope of patient preference information. How should we measure it, and how should it be adopted within the FDA. There's also a lack of agreement on the methods which meet both the needs of the patient and actually what's in the clinical trial. So sometimes the things that are important to patients are not part of the clinical trial. Should those be included, and how should the FDA handle those? And finally, there's also a shortage of experts knowledgeable in patient preference and in funding. And University of Maryland is very strong in patient preference information too, and I know they're here, and also Hopkins CERCES. So the good news is that the CERCES centers are playing a major role in helping collaborate with the FDA and pushing forward these patient preference studies and integrating those successfully. Thank you.
Okay, great, Leslie. Thank you. That gives you another idea of the kind of research that our CERCES is sponsoring. So I want the panelists and the panel moderators to please come up for our next panel. So our next panel is on academia, government, and industry in regulatory science, cross-sector collaborations, and avoiding conflict of interest. This panel was particularly designed to sort of complement what we're launching today, and that is our industry participation program. So we're hoping they can help us figure out the way forward to work together, avoid conflicts of interest. So the two moderators are going to be Howard Bauchner, editor-in-chief of JAMA, and Rob Califf, I guess, former FDA commissioner might be a good way to say it, and now he's doing other things. Okay, enough. Okay, you can introduce. Okay, you're going to go.
Okay, we ready to go? That looks like the right one. That's good. Yeah, if the last panel was anything to model, we're going to have a busy and spirited discussion here, so I'm really looking forward to it. We have a great panel with us. I think you all know Howard from his work at JAMA, but we also have Mildred Cho, professor of pediatrics at Stanford. Arthur, how do you pronounce your name? Chachala. Got it. That's great. Vice President, Head of Regulatory Affairs and Ophthalmology at Novartis. Malvina Edelman, Director of the Office of Health Technology at FDA. Carol Linden, Director of the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation at FDA. And Andrew Weber from the Accelerating Therapeutics for Opportunities in Medicine group at GSK. So it's a great group. Format is Howard and I are going to have leadership prerogative for a couple of minutes of comments. I'm going to ask Howard to go first, but we're going to try to address three questions. Are there effective models for cross-sector collaboration among academics, industry, and regulatory agencies? What are the biggest challenges for participants in cross-sector collaboration to deal with COI? And does the openness, I love this one, does the openness required by academics and patient advocacy groups limit its opportunities for collaboration with government in industry? That's a loaded question, but I loved it when they gave it to me because I want to address it. So Howard, I'll ask you to kick it off.
Thanks. So, Laura, we were already told that we should follow your approach to ensuring that everyone is on time. And the only comment I'd make, when we get to the Q&A, if people could just restrain themselves to just one question so we can move them quickly through. So conflict of interest is a daily issue at JAMA. Last year, we processed 22,000 conflict of interest forms, 22,000 across the entirety of the 12 journals. We probably get 1 or 2 opinion pieces each week about conflicts of interest, outing institutions, outing companies, outing individuals. We almost never publish those. There were 22 complaints last year of undeclared conflicts of interest. And I would say, in general, they come in 2 forms. Of the 20 or 22, 15 or 18 were focused simply on relevance. Did someone not declare a conflict of interest that a reader thought was relevant? In about a third of the cases, it was clear that there was a conflict of interest that was undeclared. There's an increasing concern that at the individual level, it's become almost impossible for individuals to cope with all of the forms that they need to complete for their academic medical center, for their hospital, for their journals. I think over the next few years, we'll see a greater and greater interest in moving away from relevance to just a complete declaration of potential conflicts of interest. And then it will be up to the reader to make a decision about whether or not it's relevant. And there's different approaches that people are talking about, but I think people are anxious to try to harmonize it across journals and academic medical centers, hospitals, centers of excellence. It's becoming increasingly difficult at the individual level. The last comment I would make, and then there'll be others during the course of the next hour, is about 6 months ago we published a paper on a new diagnostic test. And the authors declared no conflict of interest. And then about a week after we published it, we received from the chief academic officer at their institution that institution had intellectual property in that test. The authors were totally unaware that their academic institution actually owned any intellectual property. And so we grappled with whether or not we now need to begin to ask individuals if they think their institutions may have some sort of intellectual property in something that they're reporting. We've decided not to go this route, but as more and more academic medical centers have created spin-off companies, it's becoming increasingly complicated for the individual investigator. But as I said, we deal with this regularly. We write about it often. And just the last comment, we published 180 articles last year, original investigations, of which 90 were randomized clinical trials. They are challenging in many different ways. But when we publish original investigations, they undergo such intense review that I'm actually much less concerned about conflicts of interest with respect to randomized clinical trials. It says who the person was, who sponsored it. My greater concern are with opinion pieces and editorials, where it's less clear about whether or not someone's potential financial conflict of interest is influencing what they write. And there are times when we believe people's conflict of interest does preclude them, for example, from writing in certain areas, but it has become increasingly complicated.
Great, man, Howard, you set a good precedent. You were way under 5 minutes, so that's great. So I love the questions because they were very provocative for me, at least in the way that I think, and I believe we really need to reframe the way we think about this whole problem. I feel like Howard partially succumbed to the interpretation of conflict of interest as only being a financial issue, when in my experience, it's not usually the dominant issue that's affecting people's conflicts. And also, I'll just note, this is Sunday morning. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist minister, so I used to spend Sunday mornings in a different kind of event than this. But there is a thing deep in the faith that I was taught, that we are all sinners, and so that's what I want to comment on. as we think about this. The questions were posed as if there is this great thing called academia where everyone is open and transparent and where the total goal is to get the best information out there as quickly as possible, and journal editors are the great referees of it all, and they have no conflicts because, of course, they don't work for organizations like the American Medical Association, which may have some issues associated with it. I would say we live in an ecosystem where everyone has conflicts, and the issue is to understand them and deal with them depending on the problem that you're trying to approach in an appropriate way, which is something that we need to work out. So I'll just quickly go through the sectors and just say how I think we're all centers. Medical products industry is obvious. You're developing a product, a technology. There's a great reward for financial success in selling the product, getting it on the market, making it work. And this leads to all sorts of things and makes it a fairly easy but appropriate target for understanding what the conflicts are, who gets paid, and why they get paid to do what they do. But we also have this much larger part of industry, when we talk about industries, called the healthcare delivery industry, which is increasingly relevant to this. In fact, if you look at gatekeeping for pragmatic clinical trials, the biggest determinant of whether a doctor will be allowed to participate is whether the officials of the health system believe it's going to be adverse or helpful to their health system to do the trial. Try doing a trial on expensive chemotherapy in a big academic medical center whose revenue and margin are dependent on giving very expensive chemotherapy. And there are different flavors of that. If you want to see conflict, try to regulate laboratory-developed tests and watch academic medical centers send lobbyists to Capitol Hill, knowing that every congressperson knows exactly how many federal grants and employees are employed by the academic medical centers in their groups. And then we can also talk about non-academic health systems, which increasingly are growing and have their interests. Medical journals, I've already mentioned. I mean, Howard does an exemplary job, but in fact, JAMA is owned by AMA. It makes its money by selling advertisements, which are based on certain things. And it doesn't mean it can't be dealt with. It doesn't mean there aren't things in place that separate the editorial board at JAMA from these influences, but we have to acknowledge that they're potentially real. Regulators have conflicts. Read the New York Times today. I went on a tweet storm today because I thought it was such an awful, pathetic editorial that just showed a total lack of scientific understanding of where evidence generation is headed and how to fix it. But articles like that have an influence on the way regulators have to think because we live in a political world. The tech industry, now I'm fully employed by the tech industry, and my employer, Google, has been in the news a little bit over the last week. Monetizing information has conflicts. And then even patient advocacy groups, and I've written a good bit about this, the future really is more involvement of patients, but they come in different groups. The consumer representative groups behave entirely differently than those representing sick patient groups in terms of what they see as priorities, and there are reasons for that that we need to understand. Some patient advocacy groups are heavily funded by the industries that make the products, and that has led to very notable conflicts that have had to be dealt with. So my point is, we are all centers, we are all conflicted. In dealing with the ecosystem, it's not like I'm saying this is not a problem, but it's a problem for all of us that we need to work through. So with that, Mildred, now turn it over to you. You got 3 minutes to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
I'm setting my timer right now. Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk about conflict of interest. This is a topic near and dear to my heart that I studied when I was a fellow here at UCSF at the Institute for Health Policy Studies some years ago with one of your predecessors, Drummond Rennie, and Lisa Barrow. So having said that, though, I think you've already made a lot of the points that I was going to make, but I'll try to add to it a little bit. I think that one of the biggest challenges is with these cross-sector collaborations in the modern day of medical research is that they are very complex and largely institutional conflicts of interest, which are very difficult to deal with. And the patient advocacy organization issue, which you just raised, is a good example of that. And most people don't know that most patient advocacy organizations are industry funded. And that's, of course, a concern, not just because of the potential impact that conflict of interest could have on research and patient outcomes, but also, I think more broadly, we've talked a lot about diversity and needing diversity in our research databases and in clinical trials, as well as in healthcare. And I think one of the sort of unrecognized issues there that is partly based on a conflict of interest is that it's very the patients who have the voices in research and clinical trials are largely wealthy patients, right? It takes a lot of resources to serve as a patient advocacy, a patient advocate, or in a patient advocacy group. And so those voices go unheard, and so that's a type of bias that gets introduced into the whole system. Another example of that, the sort of difficulty of identifying conflicts of interest comes because I think the complexity of the arrangements we have. So, for example, in the Google relationships with healthcare systems to collect data to develop analytics for healthcare, such as the Project Nightingale that you probably have heard about. You know, a lot of the hoopla that we hear is about the potential for HIPAA violations and privacy issues, but I think really one of the major concerns is not so much the privacy per se, but what happens to the data and why are those data being collected, and what purposes are they used for? And are there conflicting interests that may potentially have ramifications for patient care? Because after all, the reason for the product is to make decisions and change decisions about how healthcare is implemented. So I think in terms of mitigation strategies, I think we all have an instinct that disclosure is a kind of weak form, and then that we need to kind of step it up a little. Anyway, so I think some of the previous panels have talked about mechanisms that we have for mitigating bias, that is systematic error. And so I think I'll just wrap up by saying that we've been talking about trustworthiness in the previous panel, and that we need to trust, but we also need to verify through creating mechanisms for evaluating bias.
That was great. Thanks. Arthur.
For those of you in the audience, Rob has his telephone timer going, so we have our 3 minutes, so we're going quickly. I wanted to acknowledge all of the comments made to date. I want to just perhaps a tiny bit of different spin on this. And for those of you who traveled across the U.S. yesterday, I had hours to think about my comments today. Dr. Eilman, I knew you were on the panel today, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a very positive aspect of it, particularly on cross-sector collaboration. And Dr. Eilman, in years past, you and I have talked about patient-reported outcomes, the 2009 guidance. Dr. Woodcock, you referred to it earlier today about patient-focused drug development, and I wanted to say over the last couple of years, there's been 4 workshops that was a cross-sector collaboration with both industry, academia, and FDA. In fact, the last one was just in December of this year. 2 guidance have been issued already, putting a lot more structure, guidance around the types of patients you should be talking to, how you should be asking these types of questions, the tools that you should develop, and guidance, because ultimately we want to have the patient's input, the patient's voice, to be used as part of regulatory decision-making. And ultimately, I think that's all of our objectives here. So I just wanted to say I think that's a positive thing. And Rob and Howard, I think even there's been real-life examples, and I'll just use Luxturna, which is a gene therapy, for those of you who don't know, approved for patients with retinal dystrophy who have a gene mutation. It's a very sad disease. These patients are young. They lose their vision early in their life, and yet the endpoint, the primary endpoint, was a performance-based outcome measure where the patients had to walk through a maze, and you saw significant improvement. It was the primary endpoint for their phase 3 program. So I think, Rob and Howard, I think there's a real-life example that we have made positive improvement in getting the patient's voice into drug development.
Thanks. All right, and you saved some time here for others. Malvina.
It's for Dr. Eidelman.
Thank you, Arthur. During my career at FDA, I've been very fortunate to be involved in a number of very successful cross-sector collaborative efforts. The one I would like to highlight today is the work that I've been fortunate to lead in incorporation of patient perspective to streamline innovation of glaucoma devices. This is the only bicoastal CERSI project that FDA has sponsored. We have worked with our colleagues at Johns Hopkins to develop a patient perspective evaluation of glaucoma, and under the leadership of Dr. Kuldev Singh at UCSF-Stanford to develop a PRO for glaucoma patients. Now, in the previous panel, we've discussed a lot about the need to be all-inclusive for diversity of patients. So at very early at the onset of this project, we realized that in order to get patient perspectives for the whole country, the 2 bicoastal centers might not be enough. So we reached out to American Glaucoma Society and asked for their help with this project. Not only did they agree, but they actually formed a special committee that has been meeting and working with us throughout the last couple of years. They have provided physicians and patients for all of our studies. With their help, we have been able to complete the patient preference studies at Johns Hopkins, and it has just published this month. Actually, we have published 3 publications with our findings on patient perspectives. As far as PRO, we have completed a web-based instrument, and we're now in the final stages of field testing. Now, this is extremely exciting because American Academy of Ophthalmology has committed to incorporate this tool in their IRIS registry. Furthermore, their industry partner, Verana Health, has committed to utilize its unique platform and analytical capabilities to simplify and to reduce the burden on the investigators during this trial. Verana Health has also agreed to lead the effort in reaching out to other glaucoma industries to collect the funding necessary to complete this project. So this is a very unique collaborative effort where we expect within the next few months to actually have a completed tool, a PRO tool, in the public space. It's going to be a free tool as a result of a collaboration of FDA, American Glaucoma Society, American Academy of Ophthalmology, Verana Health, and a number of glaucoma industry sponsors that are going to give us the funding to complete the final stages. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Almost exactly 3 minutes.
Right on time.
And a great example. Carol.
Good morning, everyone. I think I'd like to comment mostly on the, are there effective models for cross-sector collaboration among academics, industry, and regulatory agencies? And then the third question about openness. And I'll leave the metric of effectiveness up to you as to whether or not some of these things are effective or not. But sitting where I sit within the FDA and the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation, and as the office that supports the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, including UCSF-Stanford CERSI and the other 3 CERSIs, most of whom are in attendance here. We are doing this through cooperative agreement grants, which give us the opportunity to have a lot more interaction with the recipients of the grants than a regular, say, R01 NIH grant would afford. Not everybody necessarily appreciates this on both sides, so it's been a learning experience for all of us, and we've worked very hard to make these vehicles an opportunity for engagement between the academic scientists and the scientists at FDA. And I think the number of projects and the number of collaborations that have emerged over the past several years is a testament to our success in pursuing that. We encouraged all of our CERCs to engage with industry, and I think that has proved a little bit more challenging, although arguably the support for this conference and the support for the CERC fellows that you heard about earlier is a testament to some success in that arena. And we do have a mechanism for our CERCs to be able to accept and collaborate with, accept support from and collaborate with industry on CERC-related projects. They just have to make sure everybody has an understanding that this doesn't mean that the FDA, in any way, shape, or form endorses something in the industry. So we do have that in place, but it's a pretty hard sell, I think, or at least a hard lift to get that going, although I think it would be to everyone's benefit to have government, academia, and industry collaborations around important, crucial questions in regulatory science. I can't really speak for the FDA authoritatively on our interactions in terms of cross-sector collaborations, except to note that there are a multitude of public-private partnerships that the agency has put in place. And my very limited understanding of those is that they're managed by a nonprofit organization, which then has the ability to engage all the stakeholders, including FDA. And I know CEDAR, the Center for Drugs, has a number of these public-private partnerships. The Center for Devices and Regulatory Health has several, and I think maybe the Center for Biologics has a few. But that is a mechanism for interaction and to bring together a large group of stakeholders across the entire community that doesn't necessarily involve government money, which I think is a crucial issue. Let me just comment on the openness and transparency then. Under a grant, we are under the umbrella of basically openness and sharing information with the public. Under a contract, things are different because a contract is really a mechanism you put in place for somebody to perform something for you, and the you, in our case, being FDA. But under a contract, there can be clauses put in place that allow access to privileged information. So that is another mechanism of collaboration and cooperation, but not necessarily sharing that specific information with the public.
Okay, Andrew.
Thanks. I'm going to talk mostly around effective models in my recent role with the ATOM Consortium, which isn't actually, as stated up front, part of GSK, but actually it's a consortium that GSK is a part of, and it's a relatively novel model of collaborating. So it was formed about 2 years ago with 4 founding members. So we have GSK from industry, we have 2 national labs, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and Frederick National Lab for Cancer Research. And we have UCSF, who has graciously played host to us here in Mission Bay and given us a space to collaborate. And the research focus is how can we deploy a tight coupling between in silico and experimental techniques to accelerate drugs from target into the clinic. And it's unlike anything I've been a part of in that ATOM itself doesn't have any of its own employees. It's a true collaboration of people reporting from each of those independent organizations matrixed together, which is a really interesting model for collaborating, that it really makes sunshine be the best disinfectant, that everyone is seeing what everyone else is doing, and even further for effectiveness, it allows innovation because folks from industry think very different from folks from government, think very different from folks from academia about the same types of problems, and we've had a lot of success. We have large-scale experiments going on in AI and drug discovery, in how do we best predict pharmacokinetics, in drug-induced liver injury, and actually we've just released an open-source machine learning pipeline for modeling, AMPLE, the ATOM Machine Learning Pipeline, which is available on GitHub for anyone who might be interested in data science. In terms of managing conflicts of interest within this types of collaboration, I think there's a few lessons I want to highlight that we've learned over the last 2 years. One is that we strive very hard to figure out what the pre-competitive space is in any of our consortia or any of our consortia activity. It's one of the reasons why we started with PK and safety rather than moving right into efficacy and just now moving towards considering what targets we might want to look at for demonstrating these platforms that we're building. You also have to take a strong consideration for intellectual property when you're working across these organizations, both background intellectual property, what everyone's bringing into the consortium and what rights they maintain around that intellectual property, as well as generated intellectual property. When you make scientific advances, who has rights to those? Do they have exclusive rights to those? And how is the consortium going to license them openly or privately? Also have to consider legal agreements and the execution of contracts among the members, even things as esoteric as geographic governing case law can actually trip up some of these consortia. So being very careful about what your organization's requirements and their bylaws might limit your ability to collaborate. And finally, another one that's been quite interesting is thinking about collaboration and security. So how do you maintain common working environments to maintain an operational consortia and balance that with protecting the information and intellectual property of the members that are coming into the consortia?
Thanks. So just a question for the panel. So last year, MSK was on the front page of the New York Times, and it wasn't for very good reasons. I think, and I'm staring at Sam, and I'm sure the last thing he would want is UCSF faculty to be on the front page of the New York Times unless they win a Nobel Prize or there's a major scientific breakthrough. What's the public entitled to? The reason the question is so critical is that if you want to enroll patients into randomized clinical trials, for example, they have to trust that the people are conducting the trial in the best interest of the patient. And when we had our COI theme issue, Harvey Feinberg wrote the first viewpoint, and he talked about trust as being the central fabric in the patient-doctor relationship. So what is it that the public is entitled to know about individual and institutional conflicts of interest?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the public is entitled to transparency, but as I mentioned, I think that there are transparency in and of itself and disclosure of conflicts of interest is actually a mechanism that is completely inappropriate to use in a situation such as medicine or biomedical research. So the mechanism disclosure in public policy is actually developed for situations where there is agency of the public or the disclosees, right? And so that's why we have campaign finance disclosure, right? And that kind of thing, because people vote based on that knowledge. But when you have patients and research participants, they have very little power to act on that knowledge or understand what the meaning of that knowledge is. So I think transparency in and of itself is not enough, and that we could and should use methodological strategies for minimizing bias and also process strategies for evaluating bias, because often we don't even know the extent to which that bias exists.
Would anyone else like to comment?
I can jump in on that one. It's hard to comment globally. It really depends on the scenario. But I can comment from the ADAM perspective that we're actually required to publish all of our research from our members that are government lab because of their remit for public good. So everything that we do will actually be published and disclosed, which is an awesome business model for benefiting the public from accelerating and getting drugs to patients faster.
I think Mildred and I are agreeing on most things here. I think disclosure is necessary but not sufficient. And I like what you said, Howard, about there just ought to be a place where you note all of your financial conflicts, all of your financial dealings, and then it should be accessible across the board. When you have to pick and choose, like the question is, your institution have a conflict? Name me a major academic medical center that doesn't have some relationship with any part of the rest of the industry. And as I keep pointing out, by the way, we're sitting at UCSF. You tell me that this is not a financially conflicted institution in and of itself. It's in a competition in the Bay Area for patients based on reputation about its clinical services, probably not great to be a faculty member doing a study that might show a clinical service here is not very good. So just a comment there.
Maybe Howard, maybe do you think perhaps a suggestion might be more of an educational campaign on what conflicts of interest are, because there are different gradations, if you will, within that. And I just wonder, many times, and we all attend, medical symposia and so on, you'll see the lead author has a litany of conflicts of interest that they're citing and so on. And I just wonder if there's some education, particularly for the show, to your point, to the public. Do they really understand what it means and the extent of what that potential impact could be on that conclusion or that statement or that information?
Academic medical centers, particularly those that are, at one end of the spectrum around the research-intensive institutions, develop more and more relationships. The question is, what's the level of transparency that's necessary at the institutional level? I'm not sure I have the answer, but I can tell you it went awry at Memorial Sloan Kettering. It really did. Not only did it go awry for the institution, there was also a fair amount of struggles within the faculty at MSK when they found out about some of the relationships that people had developed. So it's not just for the public, but it can also be harmful for the faculty at those institutions. And I'm not quite sure what the best approach is. And the last thing, if we put patient trust in our centers at risk, there's long-term consequences to that. And I'm not sure what the effective models are to answer the first question. And what's striking to me is medicine has done a far better job than law or business or economics. There, the conflicts are often hidden in the articles that people write. At least medicine is far more transparent, although that obviously isn't the best answer.
Howard, you're drawing me out here, I'm afraid, a bit, and we do want to, I know we have to, we don't want to eat into Janet's time, because I hear she's got a firebrand talk she wants to give us, and I'm excited to hear about it. But, you have to scratch your head about why is it that after struggling for years to get clinicaltrials.gov legislation, the culprits in not reporting their clinical trials are still the academic medical centers. The one held up here is the ones for transparency and getting results out, whereas the industry has been very religious in putting its data out. So, again, I just come back to, I really like the ideas that you all have brought up about transparency needs to be there, but some level of education and process beyond that really surfaces the conflicts related to the particular issues. Miller?
Yeah, I just had one thing about the sorts of things that might be helpful for people to know, both faculty and researchers and the public. And one is some assurance that about how biases are evaluated, and that biases are more strongly evaluated or considered in situations that you mentioned, where the link between the influence and the outcomes is less clear. And that certain kinds of, so we already have mechanisms for minimizing bias in our clinical trials. We randomize, we do double blinding, we do all those things, but that doesn't really address situations like in machine learning. The machine learning is coming to conclusions that almost by definition are observations, they're observational, they're associational, and possibly associating variables that were not observed before by science. I mean, that's sort of the point of doing machine learning, is coming up with new things that you didn't know existed. And so, our models for evaluating bias in those situations haven't really been developed yet.
Great points. We do want to have a chance for audience interaction here. We've only got about 20 minutes, so would welcome you to the mic. As you're coming up, let me just mention one that I'm very involved with in my current job now. Google Health, we have 1 billion questions a day being asked on search related to health, 1 billion per day. People say, well, why don't you just surface the reliable, trustworthy information? The question is, how do you decide what reliable and trustworthy is where you can't even get two experts in the field to agree with each other, much less all the other constituents? So a lot to think about there. Russ?
Mike? Good. Russ Altman, Stanford CERSI. Thank you, panelists, for a great kickoff. I have a comment, short question. The CERSIs, I think, across the board have had trouble creating three-way collaborations between industry, academia, and the FDA. And we thought it was going to be easier than it was, and it turns out to be challenging. I don't think it's impossible. One of the issues is finding the sweet spot between an ultra-specific question that only one company cares about because it's going to help them get approved. We understand that interest, but it's not general enough. And the sweet spot of then trading that off for things that are pre-competitive and of interest to everyone, like, for example, a generally useful biomarker. So that's one thing that's been difficult. The other thing that's been difficult is just timing and budget. The time scales where people make decisions that they want to do a project is different in academia and in FDA and in industry, and none of those time constants have anything to do with one another, and that has just been a logistical challenge. But it's clear that we have to get everybody involved early. That's why we asked, by the way, for people to indicate interest in what we are thinking of as an experiment to try to get one of these going. So my question is, are you optimistic about our chances for success at bringing all three players together? I'm aware of pairwise success. Is this three-way thing a dream that we're going to be able to achieve?
I can take that one. So I'm extremely optimistic. In addition to the example that I summarized, I have been involved in quite a number of efforts where we did exactly what you said. We first identified the key question, which is unique to a number of companies. Usually it's an industry-wide issue that is expensive enough to deal with by any one individual company, and then made the case that joining resources is really in the greater good for the whole, for patients. That's what we all here for. So, as I said, I have been involved in quite a number of collaborations, one with CERSI, but I have used many different hats for other collaborative efforts where we did get industry in the same room with academia and government and have had great successes.
Russ, I'll just make a quick comment as well from that perspective. I'm totally convinced that we can be successful. And I think, Russ, to your point is, I do think we need to define that sweet spot. Clearly, at Novartis, we are encouraged to participate in these types of activities. And to your point, I really do believe there is intellectual property, there is specific differences there, but I think my focus has always been on the tools. In other words, I just talked briefly about the patient-reported outcomes. I think that tool could be used across all of the respective disease states, companies, and so on and so forth. And from there, I think that would be a huge advancement, in my opinion, about getting medicines to patients in a much expedited manner.
Quick comment, since I used to struggle with this for when I was FDA commissioner quite a bit. It is a manifestation partly of the political system in the U.S. where there are very different views of what the FDA should be for the FDA part of it. So I think for policy wonks in the audience, the next policy window, whenever that may be, perhaps November of this upcoming year, defining the sweet spot a little bit better so that people are encouraged to participate would be a really good idea.
Just one brief comment about patient-centered outcomes. So we published quite a few across the landscape of JAMA journals, quite a few papers from PCORI, which often focuses on patient-centered outcomes. And one of the areas in which PCORI struggles, and we certainly struggle in evaluating those trials, is they don't a priori tell you what's a clinically important difference. And so then they fussle with the data at the end, and we're left trying to figure out, well, did you know that that was clinically important? And it's often in the eye of the beholder, and it is one of the struggles with patient-centered outcomes. Although it's the coin of the realm at the moment, there are struggles with patient-centered outcomes.
And if I can just add one more thing to that, and that basically echoes what Arthur was just saying. In the Center of Devices, we have a program called MDDT, Medical Device Development Tool. and a lot of the collaborative efforts that I was referring to will result in validated MDDT tools, which is something that then lives in the public space and has an FDA acceptance as a valid way to as a valid tool for expediting innovation.
I'm Laura Ventvier. I'm a faculty at UCSF, but also co-founder of a company, so I'm living this conflict of interest all the time. But I'm actually at the microphone because I'm also part of a committee that was started by the American Association of Cancer Research, headed by Anna Barker and Victor Velkoliska, on this conflict of interest because of their own reasons that they experienced. And maybe to say that this committee has now come up with sort of the metrics of what needs to be transparent, what needs to be disclosed, how should we do this, and preferably to make this actually a worldwide database. But to actually to achieve that goal, and I think therefore I think it's perfect that you're also working on this from this CERSI point of view that can only be done if everybody participates. So the steps that are currently, and education is actually, has been mentioned and discussed at those committee meetings at length, because it's often that people don't really realize what could be a conflict of interest, so that education is an important part. And so organizations like ACR and ESCO and also the American Medical Association are actually, could be and probably will be important partners to actually bring this forward. So I think the point to make that I think that the step that needs to be made also to get industry heavily involved. They're part of this whole working group as well as the FDA. Rick Pastor is part of this committee. So I think it needs to be a worldwide effort so that everybody can declare their conflict of interest once, and we don't have these numerous things that we always have to go to and fill out that you already brought up. That's sort of too much work for everybody. So it's actually a plea for all of you actually to also join forces and others here in the room to make this happen, because I think that will be the easiest moving forward.
Howard, is there hope for a universal financial, I don't know whether to call it conflict of interest if you do it that way, it's more financial.
Yeah, the AAMC has been the most proactive group. So they've developed a form called Convey, in which people would enter it once a year and they check off or list all of their COIs. And then when they had to report it to their institution, their hospital, to a journal, they would click off what information was relevant. Part of the struggle is, at least the journal editors that are outside the U.S. have indicated that for most people outside the U.S., anything run by an American association is not likely to be successful or something that investigators from outside the U.S. would use. But then it will be up to each academic medical center or each hospital to decide whether or not that form is compliant with whatever their policies are. So the AAMC is working on it. Whether they'll be successful is unclear.
I think that was actually mentioned as one of one of the best examples, but it's not indeed uniformly used. And so to sort of get an awareness about everybody what this means and why this is important to be transparent and that everybody understands what potential conflicts are.
The other lurking concern, and then Laura will take your question, that crosses my desk periodically. We deserted the issue of the amount of money in terms of conflict of interest. We deserted that about 10 years ago. So the forms used to be above or below $10,000. What's crossed my desk more recently was that perhaps we need to once again consider the amount of money involved in the conflicts of interest. And I think that was highlighted because the sums were so large that were reported in the New York Times. I think that took people back about how much money was involved with some investigators. Laura?
Yeah, and I would just, I think there's unintended consequence of the huge crackdown that's happened on because of that, and for sure there should be transparent reporting, but as Rob says, everyone's a sinner. But what is the conflict? So in running a consortium, everyone says, oh, it's good to have a consortium. We want to be able to get people involved in team science. But in order to get people involved in team science, you have to then give a reward. And if someone's in academia, that is publication credit for being involved. And, not only is the burden of filling these, enormously now overburdensome conflict of interest forms, high. But every time you do it and every time you resubmit, you do it. And now you used to be able to say, on behalf of the so-and-so investigators, that now is gone, in your journal in particular, as you know. And part of the problem is then how do you give credit? I mean, part of team science is everyone is playing a role. There are investigators who really are out there explaining the trial, doing that. That's work, okay? And if you want people to collaborate, not try and write their own trial, we have to be able to honor that, and we have to honor that in an academic way. So, what's a platform trial person to do to try and encourage people as those rules tighten up, and how can we try and think about those unintended consequences and make sure that we, and then if I had to have a conflict of interest thing signed for 120 people or there's 200 people, imagine how you would do that. This is, I think, an urgent problem to solve. So I'd like to hear some comments about how people think, if we want people to work together, if we want pre-competitive collaboration, if we want to make sure that we provide incentives to people to work in teams, we have to make it possible when it comes to publication to give people credit.
Anyone have an opinion on that? I do, but we should let others. Well, I mean, you have to realize I'm the holder of the Ig Nobel Prize 1990 for the most co-authors of any paper in history up until then, from the Gusto trial, industry-funded trial that had thousands of collaborators, and we recognized all of them. But that becomes unwieldy in and of itself because there are actually people that have to take responsibility for the editorial content of the manuscript. So it gets detailed no matter how you cut it. And this is why I'm a big fan of the idea of having more universal things where you can check the box for the relevant part of it and keep your thing up to date. This is a huge issue for FDA panels. There are parts of the FDA that will not have advisory committee meetings because anyone who would qualify as a panelist is conflicted, and the people who aren't conflicted don't know anything about the topic. So they say, I mean, I had to deal with this every day. They would say, I don't want to have a panel meeting because it would be useless to do it. It wouldn't give us information that we need about. Remember, the panels don't make the decisions, the FDA employees do. So I would just say it's hard, but it is an issue of our time and a time of democratization. If we don't recognize the thousands of people and also recognize that people, if they do real work, have to get paid in order to make a living at what they're doing. If you ask why does clinical research not get done in the U.S., it's not because patients don't want to participate, it's because they don't get asked by doctors because the doctors are busy generating RVUs. And if they don't get compensated for their time, they just can't do it. So my solution is more automation, of course. I want to mention one more thing, and I know I got to do this quickly. I know I have to. I know for sure now it's entirely possible for me to figure out which parts of articles are written by ghostwriters and which are not. You don't have to be around Google Translate very long to see that you could do that. And I know now also being on the industry side how many papers are actually not written by the academics that are taking credit for them. It is a very large proportion. And, I would much rather acknowledge the conflict that there was another author, but this person needed credit than I would have the, fake stuff that goes on now where the author didn't actually write the paper. May have commented on it, but didn't write it.
Just briefly, so I would say one of the mistakes that journals made were not to acknowledge the scientists that are part of industry. They participate in studies, they create studies, they should be authors on papers. And I've said repeatedly, it's been an error if we exclude them as authors. They have legitimate authorship criteria. And I think journals need to do a much better job. And oftentimes we'll see an RCT and people will say, well, it has industry authors. And I'll say, good, I'm glad it has industry authors. They created the study, they collected the data, and they meet authorship criteria. They should be authors.
Hi, thanks. Rita Redberg, UCSF cardiologist and editor JAMA Internal Medicine. And so I wanted to get back to the points because obviously it's very complicated, conflict of interest, and actually pick up on what you just mentioned, Rob, about the panels, because I'm not convinced you have to have experts that have conflicts on the panels. I think that lots of bright people, like, as the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force model, Steve and I are on the Blue Shield Medical Advisory Panel. I mean, you can have smart people reading documents, talk to experts, but not have conflicts and make evaluations. And I think it's particularly relevant to the FDA process because FDA is so powerful in controlling what drugs, devices come to market. And we all want great breakthroughs and quickly, but I think we also have to recognize that when we rush to market, and on all the things we were talking about earlier, on intermediate endpoints, on small studies, limited follow-up, surrogates, and then we have to recognize also, and I think we would agree, our adverse events, our post-market surveillance is adverse event reporting and post-market surveillance is not a very strong system, and so we're not finding out about problems, things that didn't really work like they were supposed to, and so I think it's better to sort of have that non-conflicted, objective, high-quality evaluation for evidence early on. And the other problem with the panels is, as you said, a lot of the patient advocacy groups are industry supported. I mean, what I learned the year I worked in the Senate as a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow was, every patient group that came in to talk to us was industry supported. And that just means you're not really hearing from the patients that Mildred was talking about. You're hearing from very sophisticated patients, and they've often been, their remarks have been written out for them. The patients that are really struggling don't make it to Rockville, Maryland to participate in FDA panels and talk to FDA about it. So I think we do need to pay a lot more attention to sort of the criteria, who we put on these panels, the patients, patient outcomes are really important. And then the last point, in terms of what patients want, they want effective treatments and they also want affordable treatments. And so, the example you gave of Luxturna, it had a great outcome, but as you know, it's incredibly expensive. And that's another issue that we're not going to talk about this morning, but I think we have to recognize it's a big problem for our system.
Well, Rita and I agree on a lot, but we disagree on one part of this for sure. It's not just financial conflicts that are relevant to FDA panels, and they're, one of the concerns within the review groups of FDA is there are people who make a living just being critical and are always opposed and always think slower is better. That's a conflict too, and in fact, a lot of these people make a lot of money now with Twitter personalities and all sorts of other things that they do that are not acknowledged in the same way. And so I would just argue there needs to be a balance. And much like you said with the patient groups, this is a real issue that needs to be externalized and understood better. But at least in fundamental research that's been done, I think the average patient is a lot more intelligent about conflicts than most people give them credit. There's pretty good literature on this now about how patients think about conflicted positions. But anyway, we don't have time now to cover
1 minute.
Just wanted to, there was a lot of discussion about FDA's panel and the need for conflict of interest being extremely tight. We have, at the Center of Devices, we have something called Network of Experts, where we have collaboration with professional organizations. When we have a scientific question that's very specific, we can reach out, and as long as we know the conflict of interest, we can ask scientific questions without disclosing anything confidential related to the file. And my office has been utilizing this extensively and has been a great way for a very long time, yes.
And to follow Laura's example, your comment, and then Joe, your comment, and then we'll have to finish.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about another type of conflict of interest, which is intellectual interest. For example, I was aware of a few years ago where the Venous Thromboembolism Committee got some outside experts to come in and evaluate their recommendations and pretty much downgraded all the level of evidence routinely across things. So it strikes me this is probably as much of a problem as financial interest, and I was just wondering what is being done, if anything?
So Lisa Barrow, who's probably thought about this more than anyone else, has just recently published the types of intellectual conflicts of interest or bias, and it's a very complicated issue. The journals have tried to sort out, is there a way of which you can ask the question, and we decided there isn't. Because people have a wealth of experience and knowledge, and so that may be an intellectual conflict of interest or a bias, but it may be held because of their experience, and so it's become much more complicated. And in the world of nutrition, this is really a big issue. Joe, your comment?
Yes, I'll just make a quick comment. I'm Joe Ross from Yale. I'm the co-PI of the Yale Mayo Clinic CIRSE. And through our work with the CIRSE and our kind of a sister initiative called NEST, we've actually done a lot of collaborative work with industry, working with big companies like Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic, small companies like Bioformis, Pear Therapeutics, and sort of thinking beyond the disclosure forms, which is one way to think about conflicts. I would just make a plea for pre-specification and sort of mitigating against scope creep, because one of the key things is to publicly be accountable for what you say you're going to work on together, do that work, publish it, and make that data available to other people. And I think that is a key way to mitigate the sort of potential conflicts with collaboration.
I want to thank the panel for their absolutely excellent comments and excuse them from the podium. We now have our pre-lunch keynote address. Dr. Janet Woodcock, Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA, will bring us home to lunch. We will end at about 11. We will end at 11:50, and then there'll be a 50-minute lunch, which I will describe to you at the end of her comments. Thank you.
Can I put this down a little bit so people can see me like that?
You would like to put that down?
Yeah. Can I just move it over?
Yep. Yep.
All right.
And then you can adjust that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm short. All right. Well, what I'd like to talk to you about today is something I think I'm going to be preaching to converted here, to use Rob's metaphor in a different way. But I really need to get your input on these thoughts because I plan to take this to a wider audience, probably a much more skeptical audience. And the topic I want to talk about is why we need to fund drug development science. And by drug development science, it's more or less a subcategory maybe of regulatory science. Is a little bit different. Regulatory science always bothers me a little because it sounds like it's just something bureaucratic or that the regulators want to do. But really, what we've been talking about all morning is that the science of drug development hasn't been advanced the way it needs to be. And so what do I mean by this? Well, we heard this morning from the deans and chancellors that the basic science is really delivering, and it's just exponential growth in knowledge and understanding, and tremendous opportunity for health. But it's still extraordinarily difficult to translate that into human health benefits. Still, today, only about a tenth of trial candidates that get into the clinic ever get onto the market. In some areas like neuroscience, it's an even worse track record. The result, there's an extremely high bar to enter the market with a drug. And what does this lead to? It really leads to decreased competition, to put it really bluntly, because most ideas can't make it. It means that a tremendous amount of science is left on the cutting room floor in portfolio management or just abandonment because it can't be evaluated. Some people have talked about Eroom's law, which is the inverse of Moore's law, because over the decades, we've had tremendous increase in investment in biomedical research and R&D, pharmaceutical R&D, gone up like this, but the results have been flat, except maybe for the last 6 years. Totally flat production over decades of new molecular entities. And what this says is there's actually decreasing productivity every decade of this sector. Now, it's true that people relied upon the fact that occasionally there's a huge winner and everybody gets rich, all right? And so they're still willing to pour money in. But what I ask you, and this is what we have to think about seriously, is will society continue to pay these increasing drug prices? I think the answer is no. I think we're getting to the point of total resistance to continue to pay, or inability to pay the level of the costs for the drug spend in the United States, even though 90%, as Carl said, of the drug supply is generics and they're fairly inexpensive. The cost of these new innovations everyone's excited about is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. So that's why we're having a debate in this country over drug prices. How much science is going to be left behind if that actually happens, which is going to happen, if some kind of controls are put into place? That's what we need to think about. And do we know enough now how to streamline drug development, make it more effective, productive, and informative, and actually increase competitiveness in this space and get more of the science evaluated? No, I don't think we know enough right now, but I know right now we can really do a lot better. We can actually evaluate drugs in a way that we can much better understand their value when they get on the market, and we can make that development program much more streamlined, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, the current system, we have individual investigators doing basic science, if you're looking at the ecosystem, and we've talked about this already with academic awards for individual effort. We have individual pharmaceutical companies who are pursuing preclinical development using tools they know best and not really working collectively except in a few consortia and so forth on better tool development. In clinical development, we have individual trials for each development program, which have been studied and shown to be massively wasteful. There's incredible waste here. We also have slow recruitment. We can't get patients into trials, but there's patients out there who want to be in trials all over the country. So we're like starving in the midst of plenty because of the way we do trials. And because individual doctors, as Rob said, they don't want to give up their own patients to go in a trial, and they also don't have time or any reward or any mechanism to participate in investigations. Meanwhile, the costs of clinical development are skyrocketing, and then healthcare in the U.S. delivers spectacularly good and frequently really bad results for the public. And someone mentioned health equity. How are we going to solve this in this situation when we're having so many problems already? Now, if you take a historical look, 50 years ago, drug development was relatively simple because we didn't learn very much about drugs before they got on the market. And I know this because I've gone back and looked at the files from those times, and you could die laughing at what was actually submitted to the FDA and we were expected and did approve drugs on. Everyone was rightfully dissatisfied with how little we learned about new medicines. And as new science evolved, more and more evaluations were added, each on top of each other, until we have this giant program that is done the way it was done before, but just with more and more and more investigations required. I ask you, can we take a broad systems look at some point and figure out the best way to do this clinical evaluation if we were going to start over, if we were going to step back and think, how would we do this now? Over the years, we've had some advances, I think, that illustrate how this might be done. And some of the consortia that have been mentioned have actually provided some hints of and some advances that we can use. For example, the use of pharmacokinetics to understand exposure in animals and humans, and Carl Peck was a lot of the impetus for that. I was actually at the FDA at a time when they did tox studies and they didn't measure exposure. Well, how do you know? And they would give it orally, and then they'd do the histopathology. Like, well, there's a missing link. And in fact, in the 70s, when the generic drug program was argued and finally passed into law, until the 11th hour, they weren't going to require bioequivalence. They were simply going to require that the strength, pharmaceutical equivalence, the strength of the tablet and that sort of thing was the same. There was no pharmacokinetic information. It was hugely argued. That's how far we have come. And this, of course, has provided us tremendous insight over time and saved a lot of waste and time because we do a lot of very sophisticated pharmacokinetics now. Other examples I think that come to mind, what Francis Collins is doing with the AMP initiative, that's a public-private partnership about target identification and exploration. And the industry, NIH is putting in money, this is basic science. They're putting in money, and the industry is putting in money or people or something like that, and they're for specific diseases. They're looking at can we develop new targets in rheumatoid arthritis, in Parkinson's disease. So, but the question is, can't more basic science research be more coordinated this way so that we're actually pulling everything together and moving toward an outcome? From what I hear from that initiative, because I'm on the steering committee, that people are pretty satisfied with this. It's, again, though, it's large-scale science. It has a lot of rigor because companies have to make financial decisions based on this. So there isn't the reproducibility problems that we have with a lot of things. But people are happy and feel this has been very productive. The use of human hepatocytes is a favorite of mine to screen drugs for metabolism or use of humanized mice or what have you. In the 80s and 90s, the FDA approved a lot of drugs that just caused a huge amount of trouble and had to be withdrawn. Why? Because they had polymorphic metabolism we didn't understand. They had drug-drug interactions, or they got certain people into trouble who had different metabolism, and everybody, was finger-pointing, headlines, congressional hearings, usual kind of stuff, right? Well, all those problems have gone away because now we have the tools and we understand and we can predict these problems and decide whether the juice is worth the squeeze, for example. And we don't approve drugs where we don't understand these things now. But that was a collaboration a lot of people did to get that in place. Can we use in vitro assays for cardiac repolarization abnormalities in the ion channels? Yes, probably. We're working toward that. And again, that's a big collaboration that's going on that's going to avoid a whole lot of problems and having to do a trial. Organ on a chip or in vitro toxicology, what will it take to verify that these can stand in for animal studies? Okay. So we're hearing from Europe already, we don't want animal studies and so forth, but are these assays adequately standardized? Do they have enough rigor, okay, to be put into expensive testing? And can they be used in concert with traditional drug development programs that have traditional toxicology, and then they have the human outcomes? And if the drug is approved, they actually get on the market, and we can look further at human safety outcomes, right? Can we get together and assess their predictive value? And do we understand a pathway in which that can be done? My answer, no, we don't understand a pathway, right? We're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom and have companies do this and et cetera, and then 10, 20 years later, everybody say to the FDA, why aren't you accepting these? Well, we won't, and if we don't have rigorous data, we won't be able to do that. We need to start soon on that if we expect results in 5 to 10 years, because that's how long prospective drug development takes. And who's in charge of this translational effort? Who's thinking about this? Whose responsibility is it? Now, getting to clinical, why is clinical drug development the way it is now? What caused this? Well, it just grew up this way. Industry is in charge of much clinical translation, and because industry is focused on their specific asset, okay, that's what's in front of them. That's what they are charged to do. That's their responsibility. They can't think about systems improvement. That's really not their job. Whose job is it? I've been asking this for years. Who is going to be in charge? Is Laura going to be in charge of this? Or is Rob going to be in charge of this? Like, who is going to fix the clinical evaluation system? It is clearly broken. But there's tremendous common sense opportunities to improve the clinical trial system. But who's going to do it? Are you going to do it? There is no robust grant support for scholarly engagement in drug development science overall. There's no robust, reliable grant support. For example, okay, rigorous phenotyping in disease. Everybody agrees that is super important, right? But because it's basic science right now, we can quickly and easily genotype a person and store that information in a database, right, or many databases. We can do that very easily. But gathering the phenotypic information and having it make sense still requires a health professional, case report forms, and an extensive effort to standardize the measurements, right? So the thing that's most straightforward and has been around for a long time, standardizing clinical measurements, isn't improved. But genotyping, we're doing very well on that, right? But just doing genotypes without actually understanding and relating them to the person can only get you so far. Especially, we need to do natural history of disease in a way that's rigorous. And also, the same as what I just described applies to new biomarkers, new clinical outcome assessments, as the other panels were talking about, new patient-reported outcomes, new patient preference information. The question I ask you is, how are we going to get this? Is individual companies going to do it? Is academia, absent support, going to generate this information? Is FDA going to generate this information? We're starting to see true personalized drug development, N of 1 or 2. Are we going to be able to learn lessons from these experiments, and how are we going to to generalize that? Two other examples, generics. Carl Peck brought this up. Okay, although generics have been a tremendous benefit to the public, there were areas, I know many people who had to go to the hospital because they had to stop using their inhalers because they couldn't afford them. And that was because, being inhalers, we couldn't make people couldn't make generic copies of them. They were very complex, and the generic law didn't fit very well. Carl, we did approve generic Advair, a generic copy of Advair, and I hope we'll get more. But under the Generic Drug User Fees Act, which was now like 6 years ago, the first time, the industry offered up $25 million for research. And as Carl said, that has provided like tremendous benefits to the industry, actually, and to the public for all these things, complex drug substances, how we're going to evaluate them, drug-device combinations, unusual delivery systems, and so forth and so on. That's a very small amount of money for probably the return on investment that the society will see from this research that's going on. Manufacturing, drug manufacturing, this probably isn't of interest to many of you, but really a pharmacist from 1920 would probably recognize many of the operations that are currently done to make at least small molecule drugs in the United States. All right. And we at FDA have been, over the last 16 years, trying to work with parts of industry and everyone to move drug manufacturing into the 21st century. We have gotten a very small amount of funding, but we have been able to provide this to academic centers that have staff that work on continuous manufacturing and all computer control systems for pharmaceuticals and so on. And we're finally seeing a payoff. And I'll tell you, this payoff is going to be huge. It's going to be tremendous. You can decrease the costs. You can totally decrease the environmental impact while at the same time improving the quality of the drug product tremendously as far as your control and your ability to control quality and reliability and surge capacity. And you can decrease long supply chains, which Congress has recently become extremely exercised about because so many of our drugs are now made in India and China. So you can make drugs regionally using these new methods with much less environmental impact and much better quality. But it takes some investment, it takes some vision, it takes scholarly input of very educated people to make this happen. Each industrial partner alone will not be able to make this transformation happen. So I believe that if the U.S. is serious about translating its investment in basic science to improve health at a cost we can afford, we're going to have to invest in drug development science. And it's going to, how am I doing on time? Pretty good.
Depends on if you want questions, but 9 minutes left before lunch.
Thank you. So it's going to require, I think, specific, ongoing funding that is not like NIH funding. It is not about discovery and invention. It's about the tools and the methods to translate this basic science that's so wonderful into health outcomes that are understood, that are valuable, and that are helpful to patients. So